We are live. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. We have people from all over joining us today. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to spend some time with Excalibur Data Systems and FireScope. Today we're going to be talking about the easiest path to transforming IT from a cost center to a key business partner. We have with us today Ryan Counts. Ryan is the VP of Client Experience at FireScope. Excalibur Data Systems has been a FireScope partner for the greater part of 3 years. Super excited about their cool technology that really changes a lot of things about how IT is viewed, monitored, tracked, value being driven by your IT investments, and I think you'll find a lot of value. With that, I'm going to make Ryan the presenter. He can go ahead and tell you a little bit about himself, and we'll get started.
Awesome. Thank you, John. Okay, and thank you everybody over at Excalibur for hosting us today, and thank you everybody for joining us today. And we'll jump right into it. So, brief introduction. My name is Ryan Counts. I am the VP of Client Experience for FireScope. It means I am responsible not just for the professional services, but also support and services concepts for FireScope. I've been with the organization for nearly 12 years now, so have quite a few implementations of IT service management and IT service monitoring from FireScope under my belt. So I'm hoping this will be a good conversation. We have a series of slides that we will be going through today, and then we'll actually jump into a few practical examples at the very end, and I want to make sure that we have some time for any kind of questions that you may have and kind of make it interactive toward the end. If you have any questions during the course of this, you can post questions in the GoToWebinar application, and that'll make sure they get queued up and that we get them answered. So a quick note on the agenda, and we actually have quite a sizable chunk of content to talk about today. So in order to move toward or transform IT over from a cost center to a key business partner, it's not a easy, I'm going to flip a switch and do it. I would love to tell you it is, but unfortunately it's not. There's actually a series of steps that every organization really needs to think about and implement in order to really transform the way IT operates. So a couple of the milestones in that step and a couple of the items that we're going to be covering off on today is, first we've got to get IT some breathing room. We need to move away as much as possible from firefighting mode. And there's a number of ways that we're going to talk about of how you can accomplish that. We also want to talk about some strategies for consolidating your tool sets, automating some common tasks. Let's basically, again, give IT a little bit more breathing room by removing a lot of the day-to-day effort that tends to eat up the day. The tasks that you are repetitively doing every day, that you look up from your screen and it's already dark outside. We also want to talk about how organizations can transition from a technology to service-centric operations. And what we mean by that is not thinking as much about how each individual element within your infrastructure is performing, but instead thinking about how you're delivering services and measuring those services in a slightly different way. And specifically, measuring those from a business impact perspective. So looking at it not just from what's up, what's down, but what does that mean to the business? And how can I align my efforts to what is most important to the business? We're also going to talk about applying advanced and predictive analytics to help IT get ahead of issues by doing strategic capacity planning as an automated process. And then we're also going to talk about some techniques to communicate the value IT generates for the business, which I see as one of the low-hanging fruits for IT to really change the way the business perceives it. And speaking of perception, as we get into it, I think everybody on this call can probably agree with the statement that IT just gets no respect. And I'm really hoping that everybody on this call is old enough to understand this joke. If not, one word, Caddyshack. Please go check it out. But if we think about it historically, over the last 20 years, IT has really made leaps and bounds improvements over availability, performance of the application. We've gone from the days when we had just bare iron servers that we knew exactly everything it was running, and we spent our days and nights just doing everything we could to keep those up and running and keep those applications running. Now instead we're down to blades running dozens of VMs that have uptimes measured in years. We've got applications that are to a degree self-healing because they're evaluating themselves. We've got a lot of cross-current dependencies. We've distributed the applications behind load balancers and whatnot in order to ensure that our applications are running. And we're getting to the point where IT is reliably achieving the traditional SLAs that have been used to measure it. But if we think about it, the problem is IT is a little different from any other department within the organization. I'd actually suggest everybody on this call think about how your specific organization reports to the business in terms of success metrics. Because most organizations, IT is reporting around metrics like SLAs, which if we break it down, that's basically a measure of how often IT didn't fail. Or they're measuring by outage reports or incidence response or how many security issues we had. If we really break it down, most of IT's reporting metrics are on the negative side. How often does IT actually communicate, this is what we did for the business, this is how we helped the business move to that next line, and here's a quantitative measurement for it. And that's really the biggest hole that IT has dug for itself. We have spent too much time thinking around the mechanics of IT operation and not enough time thinking about what does that mean for the business. And if you get anything out of this particular webinar, it's that IT fundamentally means a mindset change. We need to stop thinking in terms of bits and bytes and thinking instead around how are we delivering to the business? What do those bits and bytes mean for the business? And that doesn't just mean how we communicate with the business, but also how do we measure internally within IT? What do we track? You know, ultimately, if we think about it, every piece of technology within your infrastructure was acquired to achieve an end result. I wanted to improve communication between the members of my company, so I invested in an email server or a SharePoint or a document library. I wanted to improve my sales team's ability to close sales faster, so I invested in a CRM system. All of these investments, if you really think about it, they all came back to a particular outcome that we wanted to affect within IT. But how often does IT really measure that? So that's kind of one of the key changes that IT really needs to make. We're still measuring for over 20 years. We've been obsessed with uptime and can we ping a device? What's memory and CPU utilization looking like on each of these guys? We don't, what IT fails to realize is that even if I'm succeeding in accomplishing all of those goals, that does not directly translate to revenue or growth of the business. So IT really needs to start changing how we think about our services, our infrastructure, and really start measuring from an outcome perspective. Now, that's, again, as I mentioned before, not something that you're going to flip a switch and suddenly tomorrow you're going to radically change how IT is operating. There's a number of steps that we're going to need to take to get to these ends. One of the first ones is, as I mentioned before, let's get some breathing room for IT. And that starts with filtering out a lot of the noise. I mean, if you think about a traditional IT organization, IT environment, sorry, you never have, you know, everything's running green, everything's running perfectly. There's always events going on. And there's never just one event and every other system is going to patiently wait for you to resolve that issue before the next event comes around. Instead, you're always going to have multiple events going on. You may have high latency storage, and you may have some ping failures. But I would challenge anybody on this webinar to look at this particular diagram and tell me which of those is most important. I never have enough resources within IT to be able to combat every one of these events simultaneously. So I'm always going to have to prioritize efforts. So I need the means first of identifying which of these is really meaningful to the business and which of these may be on a system that's associated with a project that's been decommissioned, and therefore it doesn't really matter, or it can be deprioritized accordingly. So that first step is we need to align all of our compute resources, all of our infrastructure really, to the services that we're delivering to the business. So right there, as we see in this diagram, I've identified what belongs to the ERP system, which is going to be important to the business. I've identified what belongs to the CRM system, which again is going to be important to the business. But you see right there in the middle, we've got a number of systems that are either from decommissioned projects, or they're from projects that are still being stood up, or some kind of non-production environment, or even IT has forgotten about them. That even though they're generating events, they don't deliver key business services, and therefore I can deprioritize those. I can focus more on what's going on in ERP and further identify and further prioritize effectively. Furthermore, as part of this service modeling, it's not just enough to have a bucket that says all these servers belong to ERP. Because if you think about it in a realistic environment, particularly with ERP, you're going to have some of these systems that are report generators or batch processes that run once a week that aren't delivering 24/7 value to that service. So we also really need to understand the flow of the service to understand which of these assets is part of the core transaction that users are expecting every day versus the ones that may have a lower SLA simply because they're only running once a week. Or they're running just particular reports for the business. So to get to this kind of view, there's a couple of key considerations that I would advocate for everybody here. Number one, you need a CMDB. And I point out, even if you don't want to call it that. I see a lot of organizations that get a little too focused on the labels. Is this truly a CMDB? And a little too focused on the features and functionality versus let's focus on the outcomes we want to drive. So even if you don't want to call it a CMDB, every organization really needs a single repository that they can bring in and consolidate all their configuration data so that all of IT is working on the same page. That resource needs the flexibility and scale to adapt because you're not going to be standing still. You're going to be implementing new technologies in the coming months, coming years, et cetera. And you need to make sure that your platform is going to work. Now, toward that end, I would say that Microsoft Excel is probably not your best bet here. So you do need a repository, but let's not focus on specifically calling it out as a CMDB. We just need to make sure that we can understand at a given moment what each of my elements is contributing to critical services, what their core configuration is like, the key information we need to really make a proper impact analysis of potential change. The second is don't worry about 100% population. I do see a lot of organizations get hung up on CMDB projects or similar projects because they're trying to figure out how to get everything. They're trying to boil the ocean in a single pass. And ultimately, that's a recipe for failure. Instead, I advocate, let's focus on the 25 to 30% of your IT assets that are really driving value. If we really look at many organizations, they've got a lot of elements that are not directly aligned with business services. So let's make sure that we're focusing on the ones that are. Also, as part of this, I highly recommend staged implementations. Don't try to boil the ocean in a single project. What we find instead is smaller projects that achieve low-hanging fruit and gain success are going to breed further success. You're going to get more teams that want to jump on board because they're seeing the value that you're able to generate with it. So this journey is not something that I want any organization taking in a 30-day, 60-day, or even 6-month process. This is something that's going to take time, that you need to take at the pace that's right for your organization. Furthermore, the most important is all this data can't be manually populated. I've seen far too many organizations try to understand configuration of their critical services in a manual approach. And the hours and days that you're going to spend doing net stats on individual servers or checking log files or running TCP dumps to figure out what assets are connecting to what, ultimately is going to fail. The challenge here is there's too much change in IT. If you try to map it manually, by the time you've finished, your maps are already out of date. And therefore, you're not going to get the value out of it. And furthermore, with any kind of CMDB project or configuration project like this, the moment users start finding inaccurate data, they're going to start suspecting all future data and ultimately stop using that resource. So we want to make sure that we've always got accurate, up-to-date information, and that's simply something that is going to have to be automated in some breed or form. And we'll show some best practices for easily populating that information a little bit later on this particular webinar. So the next step that we want to look at, once we've started mapping out our services, we want to start understanding causality in a slightly different way. So if we think about, where previously we were talking about the individual systems, if we dig a little bit deeper and start thinking about all the metrics that IT is gathering, I see organizations that are struggling with too much data that they're trying to evaluate. Fundamentally, IT needs to go on a data diet, because the wealth of data that they're already aggregating through multiple different monitoring or management platforms, each looking at different silos, are actually causing a bit of too much eventing and too much alerting for IT to really be able to cope with. If I'm looking at every metric on a server or router or switch, any kind of anomaly is going to look equal to any other, and therefore I'm going to try to troubleshoot each of those, or that's going to be my inclination. Instead, what we want to understand is the causality of metrics. And what I mean by that is we want to understand from the user experience level or the outcome metric for each of the services that we just mapped, we want to start back tracing through and understanding which attributes, which data points truly reflect how each element of a service is contributing to the outcomes of that service. So if we go back toward the beginning of the webinar, when we talked about, you invested in each service with a particular outcome in mind. I invested in email in order to improve collaboration. Well, let's start measuring that service from a perspective of that outcome that we're delivering. And when we start looking at the underlying infrastructure, let's look at each element in terms of how it's contributing to that outcome. So for example, with email, if I'm looking at a switch that is just upstream of my core email servers, I may have hundreds of interfaces on that particular switch. Only a few of those are actually routing data for my email application. So if I can focus on those interfaces, I've significantly reduced the amount of data that I'm consuming, and I can get to the heart of the matter when I may have a network issue that's causing issues with the email service. If I'm looking at a web server that's contributing to an e-commerce platform, do I really need to evaluate whether or not the FTP service is up and running? Do I need to be monitoring if the SQL agent is running on it? Well, if those do not directly contribute to the core outcome of that particular service, let's eliminate it. Let's go on that diet and start really focusing on the attributes that affect. What that's also going to help IT with is to identify when I do have a downstream technology issue that is impacting user experiences, and I can get to the heart of the matter much faster. So I'm going to be able to identify issues faster. I'm going to be able to get to the root cause much faster and resume normal operations much faster and more effectively. Furthermore, once we've identified these attributes, I highly recommend organizations really start moving toward a baseline approach by that. So again, looking at the last 20 years of monitoring and management with IT, we tended to, for lack of any other option in previous years, use fixed metrics to evaluate systems against. The perfect example is CPU utilization. I see many organizations looking at CPU from the perspective of, do I have an event where CPU is greater than 90%? Well, in a lot of platforms, particularly Windows, there's a number of scenarios where a CPU could momentarily flash past 90%. Somebody hit the start button. That doesn't particularly denote that I've actually got a particular issue with that particular system. Instead, what's more meaningful for organizations, and now that compute has really reached the point where we can do this on a real-time basis through vast amounts of data, we need to baseline everything. And I need to evaluate for what is normal for my organization. And these baselines don't need to be just on a CPU level or within the infrastructure metrics. We should be applying baselines in a much broader set than I see with most organizations. So think about baselines like number of concurrent user sessions that I have on a web application. That's going to help me identify if I have a downstream failure that suddenly caused authentication issues. So suddenly I've seen a drop in the number of authenticated users. Conversely, if I have a security issue, I suddenly saw a spike of 10,000 users connecting into the system that may be highly abnormal, that indicates maybe a DOS attack or some similar significant threat to that particular application. We can also look at it from a capacity standpoint, what's memory utilization, storage utilization, how many transactions are we performing? We really need to baseline each of these. And what that's also going to help IT do is start identifying when we have a technology versus a market source for issues. So there are scenarios where marketing launched a very successful campaign and we suddenly saw a large increase in performance that caused some capacity issues. Well, we need to identify that was fundamentally caused by a significant increase in user activity. And I'm not going to know that unless I've got a good baseline for these kind of metrics. I can also use that to say when I see abnormal activity with outcome-related metrics for a service, where do I see similar issues downstream in the technology? Did I see a sudden drop in user activity at the same time that I've seen increased latency at the storage tier? If I have those two together, we get back to that causality metric. I start reducing the number of events that IT has to troubleshoot, and I also resume those issues much more quickly. So once we've gotten onto those elements, now we want to start looking for how IT can kind of shift its thinking. So once we've identified the outcomes that we want to measure for a service, we've modeled out those services. Now we want to move toward shifting IT's thinking in terms of not just availability, have we achieved 99.999% SLAs, but how can we identify some short-term attainable goals for IT that really focus on the business metrics that we want to affect. So how can we set goals for, let's reduce the transaction time by 50 milliseconds? Where can we find low-hanging fruit within the infrastructure that's going to help us do that? Where can we do some code changes that are going to improve customer experiences? Where can we do things for IT that are shifting the thinking, not just in terms of availability, but in terms of driving business outcomes in a way that we can then start working with the organization and really showing IT as a fundamental business partner. So that kind of brings us to our next element, where IT really needs to start more effectively collaborating with the rest of the organization. We discussed business outcome metrics earlier and really understanding services from the outcomes that they're delivering. But in order to really understand those outcomes, the best way to understand that is discussing that with your line of business partners. Let's get with the business and understand, what are you measuring each week as a success metric? And now let me backtrace to see, how does IT support those metrics? Because if we think about it, every department within the organization, a portion of their success is actually driven by IT. If you didn't have the e-commerce platforms or the EMR platforms or the SAP systems up and running, are any of those departments going to be successful? No. So you are helping them achieve some of their goals, but what we want to do is start shifting this so that IT is working with those organizations to understand, what are the goals that you're trying to achieve and how can I help you achieve those with IT? Because like it or not, what we found is that many of these business units have gotten a taste for technology project. We've seen shadow IT out there. They've started engaging it, and because they are looking at it from a very different perspective, they're not looking at technology metrics in the way that IT tends to do it. They look at these other projects from a business perspective. And I think IT can learn a lot from a collaboration with them in terms of how they look at technology and how they communicate with it. So toward that end, another key element that IT is really going to have to do is start thinking cross silos in ways that we really haven't done before. So if we think about a typical service, we take a top-down approach here. We want to look at things like the outcomes that we're collecting from services. We want to understand user experiences. That's going to be another key that if you're not doing today is an absolute essential for the next year. IT needs to be able to use those two metrics because those are going to help correlate when we have anything going downstream that may be impacting those. So what that means is looking at things like revenue generation. Let's look for latency within the services. Let's look for query performance. But what we want to do is measure those in a way that we can identify when each of these downstream metrics is affecting the user experience or affecting revenue generation. Those are going to be the priority one events that we want to raise up to the organization and make sure that IT is working as priority one. And conversely, any event that's not impacting those, we want to make sure they're deprioritized just so they're clearing the way to make sure that we're focusing on what matters today. So to do this, we really need to consolidate. IT cannot accomplish this with multiple monitoring tools, each looking at each of these layers in isolation. That's one of the challenges I've seen a lot of organizations trying to achieve with event management products, where they leverage events from the network monitoring tool and the application server tool. And the challenge here is if I'm not looking at the attributes directly, it's much more difficult to see the causality across traditional silos. Instead, what I need to do is be able to directly measure all of these metrics against each other and in real time see where a downstream collision on the network or increase in collisions is causing an impact on user experience. And that's something that must be achieved through a single repository. The final step that IT really needs to do, or sorry, second to final step, is communicate all that value. So as part of this, once you've started identifying the outcome metrics, we've started identifying how IT supports key business projects. We've started identifying the causality between downstream technology performance and the user experiences and outcomes that they're affecting. We've also started looking for short-term goals for IT to really start pushing business objectives. Once we've got all that together, now we need to start communicating this to the business. We need to start shifting our SLAs to a much more meaningful SLA that says, how are we achieving business goals versus how are we achieving uptime? We also need to make sure that IT is communicating in a way that is quantifying the value that IT is delivering. And the best way to do that is dashboards delivered to line of business owners that show the key business processes, applications, and services that they rely on and how IT has been delivering value to their organization. And we'll show a few examples here very shortly. We also need to shift the way that we invest in IT. So what we mean by that is if you think about how IT goes for budget cycles, how they request budget, they tend to go to the business and say, hey, I need $10,000 to expand storage. If we don't do it, well, there's a very high chance that we're going to run out of storage here very shortly, and we're going to have an outage. Unfortunately, that's not the way the rest of the business is operating. So if you put yourself in the mindset of a CEO, he's got 3 meetings coming up today. He's got the sales director, he's got the marketing director, and the IT director all coming in. So the sales director comes in and says, I need $10,000 per month in order to hire on a third-party lead generation, or a third-party sales accelerator team. And they're going to help me bring in $1.5 million in revenue. So the CEO is going, okay, so that looks like a pretty good bet for me. That revenue would be tempting. The marketing director then comes in and he says, I also need $10,000 a month because I want to leverage these automation platforms to help me increase the number of leads I'm generating. And with that investment, I think we're going to increase our lead to opportunity metric by at least 25%. So we're going to increase the number of customers that you're going to bring in by at least 20%. Okay, well, that's delivering value to the business. Unfortunately, then the IT director comes in who says, I need $10,000. If I don't have it sometime, somewhere, we're going to have a service outage. I can't tell you when, I can't tell you how severe it's going to be, but we need this investment. Now, even the best CEO is going to look at that and go, well, if I have limited budget, I can only place one bet on one of these projects. Put yourself in his shoes. where is he going to spend the money? Even the best CEO is going to put that money in either marketing or sales in the hopes that the revenue generated can then fund that IT project. Instead, what IT needs to be doing is going to the business and saying, based off the rate of growth of customers, in order to support the objectives that the sales and marketing teams have set for themselves, I'm going to need to expand storage, because at this point, in 30 days, you're going to run out of storage, and I cannot support that growth. So in order to help achieve those business goals, I'm going to need additional storage. That becomes a fundamentally different conversation with the CEO, and really helps change the way whether or not IT budgets get approved or if they get slashed. So a couple of points that we've been making in the previous slides that I kind of wanted to bring together and make sure that we all understood. So the key ways that IT really needs to change how it's looking. One, we need to start integrating effects of IT. We need to start measuring, what are we doing for the business? What outcomes are we driving? And we need to start measuring and monitoring that service in terms of how we're achieving those outcomes. We also need to start blending data across traditional stacks, because increasingly we're adding additional layers of abstraction into our infrastructure that's causing more cross-silo issues. So now I've got issues, if we think about Docker containers and the cloud services that many organizations are starting to embrace, those are all living more and more layers beyond the bare iron that they're running on than we ever had before. And that trend is only going to increase. And where that challenges us is now we're going to see scenarios where issues down at the iron is going to start affecting those virtualization clusters or similar technologies in ways that we haven't seen in the past. And unless we start blending that data across traditional silos, we're not going to identify many of these scenarios. We also need to start evaluating services. We really need to start thinking in terms of the applications or processes that IT is supporting versus a collection of services. We need to make sure that we understand the flow of transactions and that we're managing the attributes or metrics that are really affecting the outcomes of these services. And then furthermore, we need to make sure that we're communicating that value generation. So a brief look at how FireScope is helping organizations do that. So we have two products, FireScope Discovery and Dependency Mapping and FireScope Stratus. So FireScope DDM for short is a service dependency modeling application. So we enable organizations to very quickly, and when I say quickly, I'm talking in a couple of days, map their critical services and fully understand what it takes to deliver user experiences. The other product that we offer is FireScope Stratus, which is an enterprise service monitoring platform and service assurance platform that helps organizations start monitoring these services exactly as we've been describing today. So we start measuring the outcomes of services. We start measuring the revenue that we're generating, and we start aligning that monitoring with the downstream infrastructure monitoring so we can identify which infrastructure events are actually affecting the business's ability to achieve its goals. Now, both of these products reside on the same code base and are delivered as SaaS. So it's very easy for many organizations to take advantage of both products without having to go through a long implementation project where they've got to stand up hundreds of servers and hundreds of applications in order to get deep monitoring of their environment. And what we help organizations do is, if we think about the Gartner's IT maturity curve, we help organizations from any of the traditional layers, stages of this model move up a measure. So many of the organizations that we talk to today are really still stuck down in the awareness area, where we help them start mapping out their services. We start aligning to services and standardize their monitoring to help get them up a layer. Then we also start helping them understand the user experience perspective and start working toward day-to-day process maturity and eliminating a lot of the noise that IT has to struggle with. Then we help measure business impact, which helps organizations move into the service line category and start really being a trusted service provider. From there, The final stage is where we start measuring outcomes and communicating the value that IT delivers. So this is not, again, something that we flip a switch and suddenly IT has changed. We help organizations evolve their practices at a pace that suits that particular organization. But we do it from a single product, so you're not constantly going back and having to purchase additional modules or applications or solutions out there in order to achieve the next level of IT maturity. So with that, why don't we take a look at it in action? So what we're actually going to see today is a combined view of both products. So this particular instance is actually licensed for both FireScope DDM and FireScope Stratus. So I like to start the understanding with the ends that we want to achieve. And what I mean by that is, in particular, this view. What FireScope allows organizations to do is map out your business processes, map out your business services, and start measuring them from that perspective. So in this case, we've got a quote to payment process. So this is an online application that I'm delivering that users are able to come in, generate a quote, order a product, have it shipped out to them, and then they go through full fulfillment. So toward that end, we've actually modeled end-to-end, what does it look like on this process? So on the front end, naturally, this is a web application. So we want to measure what is our user experience. And you'll notice we've got some red light, green lights indicating where we have potential technology risk that is putting this business process at risk of not achieving its goals. Additionally, within here, you'll notice we're looking at things like the user experience. So we're looking at some traditional IT metrics like average response time for the user experience, how they're able to perform. We're also looking at some key business metrics to understand some of that causality we talked about before. So some of that is looking at the number of orders in queue. What's our month-to-date revenue generation look like? How is our ability to ship the products in terms of IT's support of that particular function? We're also looking at some sub-services that are also contributing toward this particular business process that are services in and of themselves, like PeopleSoft, for example. So if we take a look at this from a business perspective, I've already identified I've got a few points of potential risk. And for each of these, this is fully interactive. So I can drill down and start looking at the user experience. So I can see where I've got huge response times on the home page. So now I want to dig in and understand where I may have a technology causality behind that. But the key here is that by simulating the user experience, going out and adding items to a shopping cart, going through the checkout process, submitting the information, and at each step measuring response times, download speeds, response codes, we're getting a sense of how that service as a whole is holistically running, because it really takes all the downstream dependencies of the service to really deliver this particular experience for my customers. If I jump back over, I also see that I've got a particular service that's in a failed state. So in this case, I'm actually going to jump over to the Service Explorer and say, I want to understand what's causing this to be in a failed state. In this case, I've got a particular policy that is triggered off, and I've got a couple of servers that are not responding to ping checks in this case. So we've got a true outage for this particular service. Now, the key part here with FireScope is that I was able to go from the top level service that was in a failed state down to the root cause, which is a couple of filers and a couple of VMs that are down in just a couple of clicks. Now, to do that, I need to understand that service dependency. And that's where we typically start with FireScope implementations on the DDM side of things. So now that we've seen kind of the outcome, let's briefly look at how we got there. So in order to achieve this, in order to map out these services, the first thing we typically do is use our DDM product. And what we do is we implement a edge virtual machine within the customer's environment that aggregates NetFlow, SFlow, or even raw packet data from your systems to understand how your different servers are communicating with each other. And that usually results in a raw map like this, where I'm seeing every connection that's going on out within my infrastructure. And from here, I can do a good bit of diagnostics and investigation of my network by looking at, okay, I want to see all of my web servers that are out there. So I can quickly drill down and start filtering. Oh, I'm filtering by a particular IP, and that's not a web server. So if I drill down, now suddenly I'm seeing all of the web servers that are out there and who's calling those particular web servers. So I understand where my potential entry points for services are that I need to map. What we also do with FireScope DDM is map out destination points for services. So one of the things that we do is generate this network destinations page where we look for scenarios where multiple unique IP addresses are all calling the same destination IP address and port. So that may be port 443 or port 80 for web applications, but it can also be application server ports like 8086 or some infrastructure port like 53 for DNS. In each of these cases, we track how many unique IP addresses we've seen call that. And this basically gives our customers an easy button where they can go through and say, and identify, these are the services that are important to me. Okay, I want to map this particular service because we've seen a large number of users consume it. Let's trigger it. So all we have to do is check it off, tell it go create a new service group, give it a name, and FireScope then takes all that NetFlow data that we've been generating and generates a dependency map for that particular service. I'll look at a few of them over here right now. So if I go into the, let's take a look at the Ecology Discovery for this one. And we'll see we've got a number of application dependencies within this map. And essentially, these are all the communications that we've seen from an entry point of the service down through essentially the bare iron for this particular service. If we look over at the legend, we're actually looking at multiple layers of a particular service. So we're looking at application, network layers, storage layers, virtualization, etc. So we're bringing it all together from all that NetFlow data to understand that from the moment users requested that entry point, who did it call? And then who did those dependencies call in terms of delivering this particular service? Let's take a look at a slightly different example here in a moment. So sometimes these can be quite complex services. The key part here is that we've automated this process. Instead of having to go manually check each system or to manually document each of these systems, instead FireScope is continually tracking the dependencies of any given service. So as new VMs are stood up, we're seeing that change in the service topology. As VMs are decommissioned, we're seeing that change. All that NetFlow data that we're continually aggregating at the edge devices continually monitored for any kind of changes to these service topologies. And then further, what their upstream dependencies are like in terms of the network. Are they VMs and therefore running on a particular VM host? Things like that that really help organizations understand the context of what it takes to deliver a user experience. I have yet to have a single customer go through this process and have the service exactly match what they expected prior to the implementation. There's always surprises that we find within the infrastructure. We had one customer that swore up and down before the beginning of the implementation that we had migrated all of our email servers up to the cloud. We're not running any localized SMTP, IMAP, or anything of the like, so don't even bother mapping it. Well, just on a whim, we decided to go ahead and map it. And lo and behold, they still had 8 SMTP servers running within their infrastructure that a number of applications were hard-coded to use. And as a result, it really kind of changed up some of their plans due to the fact that those applications were still using those VMs. It was a good thing they hadn't fully decommissioned all of them. Otherwise, they would have started losing notifications from applications, automated reports, things like that. So once we started building out these kind of service maps, what FireScope also does is we blend multiple discovery engines to now start understanding what does it take to deliver each of these services. So we combine network discovery, which is a Nmap style discovery, where we take each of those dependencies for the service and understand what its configuration is like. What is its OS? Is it a network device? In which case, what can we gather from an SNMP perspective? We also do full cluster discovery, where we identify all of the apps and VIPs, pools and members for each of your load balancers in order to understand those kinds of service dependencies. Furthermore, we also do a virtual discovery using VMware's API in order to start evaluating all your VMware infrastructure. Now, one important note I like to make is with many of these discoveries that I'm seeing like this, There's no configuration change from the user. All you really have to do is give us credentials for VMware, kick off the discovery, and we automatically pick it up. And we also start automatically monitoring each of these elements. So we're already collecting CPU utilization, memory, storage utilization across all of these elements. Furthermore, we can do the same thing with AWS. We've already mentioned the network infrastructure. We're already monitoring from an SMP standpoint. So the end result is gathering all of our monitoring into a single platform. We also have an optional agent that lets us investigate the individual servers in terms of their health and in terms of their ability to run key services, the rate of growth of key processes in terms of memory utilization, etc. Additionally, another element to FireScope's monitoring is automated baselines. So we do this in a number of ways. So one, we have a concept called a percentile attribute. So as we're evaluating all of the CPU utilization, for example, on this particular server, I'm also generating a baseline for what's normal for this particular server. And this is a shifting baseline, because if we think about it, many organizations are seasonal, retail in particular. What is normal for CPU for an e-commerce platform in November is not the same that I would expect in April when I am out of the Christmas season, for example. So what we do is we evaluate as much as possible on these key attributes against baselines to understand normal behavior and alert against abnormal behavior. We also have a concept called days to target, which we use in a number of scenarios, not only being storage as the obvious example, such as here, how many days do I have until I fill up my C drive, in which case I've got 144 days, but I can also apply the same kind of predictive analytics to any attribute I'm gathering. So I can also evaluate that against concurrent user sessions on my SAP application. How many new user registrations we've had for our online member application, for example. I can apply that to any of those to start looking at what is the historic trend of growth for these particular metrics, and how long do I have until I reach particular milestones that may trigger off the need to expand capacity for the downstream dependencies of that particular service. The end result is a better understanding of how IT delivers value for the organization. And if I can show one more particular dashboard that I believe is actually of a little bit more use for not just IT, but the rest of the business. This is something we actually put together for a mortgage client of ours that wanted to fully understand their originations process for mortgage. So essentially what we've done is we've mapped the entire chain of events from the moment a customer goes to their online application and requests a mortgage. And we're evaluating each of the key business processes that is taking place from that entire round trip all the way through when they have received the keys to their new house and they've closed out on that mortgage. At each layer, we're not just looking at technology metrics, we're also looking at like the average number of days in originations. How many quotes have we seen submitted? What is our document verification rate? A lot of these metrics are not just meaningful to IT, but they're also meaningful for the business. So my line of business owners can sign on to this and look at this and see where do we have technology issues that may be putting these at risk. Like in this case, we've got a full red down in this section. So if I drill down here and say, I want to see what's going on here, I can quickly drill down and see now from an infrastructure perspective, here's where I've got servers that have failed and therefore are causing some issues with delivery of this particular service. But the key point is that I'm communicating not just the service health, but I'm also communicating how it's delivering value for the business. So I've made IT a key business partner for this organization because they're looking at the same metrics that the rest of the organization is looking at. And they're looking at IT from the perspective of how they're driving those particular metrics. Okay. So at this point, we're ready to wind down this particular session. I do hope this was informational for everybody involved. I'd like to open this up to see if we have any questions from the audience and answer any of those that may be. Okay.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.
Appreciate you taking the time. If anybody here has a question, you could drop it into the question section on the GoToMeeting.
Okay. And with
all right, Ryan, I got a question in.
Okay.
Sam in Miami. Oh man, looking out at all the snow here in Pittsburgh, where I am. I'm jealous of you being in Miami first and foremost. Wants to know, their CIO recently hired some business relationship managers focused on driving more IT value, and is asking, it's a bit long-winded, but do you have any suggestions on how to translate all this technical speak that you talk here to go in and talk with the CFO or the board? Or how do you take these diagrams and such that you're showing here and put it into something that's easily consumable by the business?
Okay. I think it first starts with an interview. Take the time to spend an hour or two with the line of business owners and understand, what are you tracking on a day-to-day basis? Because IT has a sense of these metrics, but I find in most organizations they don't understand all of them. And from that information, how are you reporting to the rest of the business? And then IT needs to go back and evaluate the infrastructure and look at, where are these metrics driven by IT? And where possible, how can IT measure how it's helping deliver those particular metrics? From there, it's a collaborative process. It's going back to them with a first iteration of the map, going, okay, here's the key services that are driving the key business metrics that you monitor every day. And by the way, here's where we are aggregating and looking at how IT is delivering those. Now, what else can we include in this? And usually when you get that first draft in front of them, that gets them energized. They're going to start bringing things to the conversation that you hadn't expected. They're going to start asking for additional information. You give them a taste of some of these dashboards, and 9 times out of 10, they're going to want more, and they're going to help you get there, because this is helping them achieve their goals in the business. And when IT is open to that kind of collaboration, I think they'll find a lot of uptick from the rest of the business. Okay. Do we have any other questions?
Oh, Ryan, I'm sorry, I was talking into the mute button. I don't know how many times I've done that in my life. There is another question that came in here from Jim in Pittsburgh. Jim said that their company recently, about 3 years ago, implemented Apptio, and they wondered how and if you've done any integrations with IT financial management software.
We've done some limited integrations with those. Predominantly, it would actually be kind of bi-directional in the few cases that we've done it. For one, we would be communicating some of the outcome metrics and utilization metrics. We have, behind the scenes of our product, a full RESTful API. So about 85% of everything that I do within the interface of the product can also be done through the API. So we can either push out data to third parties like Apptio, and they can consume those metrics. Like, for example, like AWS, we can consume, how much CPU time that we've consumed for each service for each dependency, in order to identify how much it's cost us to operate. And we can also look at rates of growth to see how much storage we're going to need in the future on that. In terms of consuming data from Apptio, we tend to pull over more metrics around the cost of delivering a service, basically the output metrics from Apptio, and aligning those into these dashboards. Now, a lot of that data we're not doing eventing around. Most of that data we're leveraging in dashboards, but we can use that to help measure the business impact of particular events.
Gotcha. Well, that's all the time we have today. I appreciate everybody taking the time out of your busy schedules to spend some time with Ryan and I. This will be uploaded to the Excalibur Data Systems YouTube channel in the coming days, and we'll also send all of you a copy of the recording. Thank you for your time. Have a wonderful day, evening, morning, wherever you are in the world. Thank you.
Thank you all.